Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador. Shape regional policy. I'm Clara Villatoro, Strategic Communication Manager of the National Immigration Forum. We're glad you're here today with us. We know our audience includes more than 40 nationalities and a variety of organizations are represented. So thank you for your interest in this event. And I will switch briefly to Spanish. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a nuestro seminario web sobre el estudio titulado Narrativas sobre la migración en el norte de Centroamérica, cómo las historias contrapuestas sobre la emigración y la inmigración en Guatemala, Honduras y El Salvador dan forma a la política regional. Soy Clara Villatoro, gerente de comunicaciones del Foro Nacional de Inmigración, y nos alegra contar con su presencia en este evento. Sabemos que nuestra audiencia incluye la representación de más de 40 nacionalidades y tenemos también una buena muestra de diversas organizaciones y sectores representados acá. Gracias por el interés en el evento. Antes de comenzar oficialmente, quisiera mencionar algunos aspectos logísticos, así que voy a cambiar un ratito a inglés y vuelvo a español. Before starting, I would like to mention some logistics. Give me a moment. About interpretation. So this interpretation will be in Spanish. So if you speak English, you don't have to worry about that. I will switch briefly to Spanish and then I'll be back with you all. En sus pantallas van a ver información de cómo acceder a la interpretación en español. Por favor, asegúrese de localizar la opción para interpretación y seleccionar la opción necesaria. Si la desea, puede también silenciar el audio original y solo escuchar el audio en español de la intérprete y no escuchar los dos idiomas al mismo tiempo. As a quick explanation too, in this webinar, there is no voice Q&A. So to ask a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at any time during the webinar. No se realizarán preguntas en voz alta. Si tiene alguna pregunta, por favor, utilice la función de preguntas y respuestas en la parte baja de su pantalla. Es una especie de chat en el que pueden escribir preguntas durante el evento. A partir de ahora, comienza completamente en inglés el evento. Así que, por favor, asegúrese de haber seleccionado la interpretación en español, si esa es la opción que usted desea. So welcome again, and I want to welcome Haim Malka from Metropolitan Group, who will offer some initial remarks. So Haim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clara, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this conversation, and we're so pleased that you're all with us today. On behalf of the National Immigration Forum, Migration Policy Institute, RAND Corporation, and Metropolitan Group, I'd also like to welcome everyone to this timely discussion about migration narratives in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And the report that the authors are going to share with you today is really the latest iteration of an ongoing combined effort by these four organizations to identify and map salient and dominant narratives about migration. And we started this effort in 2021. We published a report entitled How We Talk About Migration, the link between migration narratives, policy, and power, which examined migration narratives in 5 countries: the United States, Colombia, Sweden, Lebanon, and Morocco, 5 very different countries. And one of the core takeaways of that initial research report was how migration narratives are weaponized by numerous actors to advance a wide range of policy objectives, agendas, and oftentimes those agendas and objectives are unconnected to migration. And we're seeing this a lot in the news today, in the events that we're all following around the world. And we followed that initial study with this current report and study focused on El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, 3 countries where migration trends, immigration and immigration, are evolving rapidly in ways that often leave national governments and neighboring governments like the United States and Mexico really scrambling to adjust and manage the movement of people, and sometimes making decisions and policies based on outdated assumptions or data. And at the same time, the public discourse and the media coverage about this issue often talks about migration and migrants in whole numbers. So for example, we hear about 20,000 migrants were in US Border Patrol custody during a specific month, or 10,000 migrants were returned to Mexico by the United States during a specific time period. And that reporting and the public debate often frames migrants as victims with little or no agency. What I think this report really does is help us remember that within this polarized policy debate about immigration, we're actually talking about real individuals and humans, not migrants, not Salvadorans, not Guatemalans, not numbers, but real people. So this report really helps humanize the debate about immigration, migration in important ways. And what I think is also unique about this study, and what makes this report so important now, is it not only examines the high-level policy debates and narratives about migration, but more importantly, it examines the narratives in local communities about the benefits of staying, about the opportunity of leaving, about the different risks of staying or leaving one's home. And it identifies and analyzes these competing, intersecting, and often conflicting narratives that are at play from a wide range of actors, often with competing interests. So governments in Central America, for example, are advancing narratives that either frame immigration in positive or negative terms. The US government is advancing narratives about migration. We heard one from the Homeland Security Secretary saying that our border is not open. That is a clear narrative. Smugglers are oftentimes spreading disinformation about immigration to encourage people to leave their homes. Family members who may have settled outside of their home countries are also advancing narratives and telling stories about the benefits and risks. And so the people in the local communities that are having to make choices about whether to stay, whether to leave, are trying to process and make sense of all of these competing different narratives. Understanding that narrative landscape and how the narratives intersect, where they conflict, is critical, because narratives more broadly help us make sense of all the data and stories we're hearing around us. They help us make choices, and ultimately they spark action. So there's a clear link between narratives, people's choices and actions, and policy that we should all be paying close attention to. And this research, this study, the report that the authors are going to talk about in just a minute, really helps us understand that narrative landscape, how these narrative patterns intersect, how they contradict, and how the stories unfold across the wide spectrum of the immigration continuum. So I want to thank the authors, the researchers that did excellent work, Humanity United for supporting this work and believing in the importance of narratives, and thank all of you for joining us today. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Clara.
Thank you, Han, for that message. And we definitely want to learn more about the study. For those of you participating and asking for the report, yes, we will share soon our websites where you could find the full report. So this morning, the authors of the study are joining us to explain more about the project. Before our conversation, I would like to mention more details about the research. This is a comparative analysis of 3 case studies, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Researchers analyzed more than 200 documents, including government policy documents, local and national media articles, and reports by international organizations, as well as local NGOs, all supplemented with relevant background literature, public opinion polling, and data on migration trends. They came away with 10 main findings on the migration narratives in the region, and now we will dive deeper into those findings. So welcome Ariel, Ruiz Soto, Natalia, Banulescu-Bogdan, but from the Migration Policy Institute, and Aaron Clark-Ginsberg of RAND. So let's go directly to the first question. So please, each of you can take a minute and help with share with us what are the main takeaways that you would like to share from this study.
Thank you, Clara, and appreciate everybody joining us today. It's an important conversation that has significant implications, I believe, in the current time period that we find ourselves. As Chaim mentioned, it is very timely because of the current migration trends that we're seeing, but also because of the current potential for policy changes to include more of these migrant narratives, as well as how they intersect, and we'll get more into that. To me, in terms of findings, we had 10 findings, but to me, one of the most important one of them was really the pervasiveness of narratives about security and insecurity in the region. And we looked over 200 documents and from different sources, but security and insecurity were a little less than half of all the documents that we found. And that means that it really diversified how it's presented, who was talking about it, primarily politicians, I should say. But overall, it was really present in every country that we saw, including some influence from Mexico and the United States. Specifically, the reason why, and it's not new that migration has been tied to security and security issues, for example, that migrants are by migrating regularly in some cases bring security concerns or threats to countries, as is something that has been happening in Central America, like in the United States-Mexico border and other parts of the world for years now. But the specific component of how widely dispersed it is and specific to different nationality groups, I think has been different. And the aspect to me that's specific to that conversation is that even though Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have been talking about emigration for a long time, they're right now thinking about also transit migration as a potential security concern for the countries as well. We can talk more about this at the end in questions, but the significant more hemispheric flow is coming through Central America, and that potentially may have an impact. Perhaps the most clear example that we have to date are the migrant caravans that we observed happen in 2018 and 2019, including even some in 2021, where Central American countries, including Guatemala specifically, looked at how to deter migrants from coming in to caravans, what the aspects, for example, that they may be becoming a threat because of COVID at that time, and or other smuggling networks and what they wanted to do. So that was a significant change that we saw over the period that we observed, which was from 2018 to 2022. The other part that was interesting to me about how security and insecurity is portrayed in narratives is that there is some slight differences that are important. For example, while in Guatemala, as I mentioned, the caravans had taken a significant front stage issue, in Honduras, the caravans were talked about a little differently. They were understood as a method for migrants to try to leave with less resources, but to still leave irregularly. And the governments in each of these countries really were caught in the middle at some times to try to talk about how they represent the threat of security for immigrants or transit migrants, but also how to think of the security to protect their own migrants who are going through different transit countries. A very key example is Honduras in 2018, 2019, trying to say and be louder about protections for Hondurans traveling across Central America into Mexico and then into the United States. So what I conclude from this is that even though security has been existent in the bloodstream of how migration is talked about in Central America for years, there are nuances in how policymakers and stakeholders are trying to revive this issue today. And I suspect it will continue to move us forward, specifically across the different ports. El Salvador didn't really talk as much about security of immigrants, but security of why reasons people migrate, for example. And again, Honduras is now in a very different stage, but at least when we observed it, it was something that really stood out to us. So I'll leave it there for now.
Yes, please.
Should I jump in next? Thank you so much, Clara. For me, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we saw values being invoked in the narratives that we looked at. And just to take a tiny step back, the context is that one of the most important findings, I think, to come out of public opinion and narratives research in the past few years, including past research that we've done together, is that no one side of an issue has a monopoly on values. And so people on either side of the immigration debate can both be motivated by core values. People pushing for greater restrictions are often motivated by values like authority and loyalty. Those advocating for greater openness are sometimes motivated by compassion and care. And so people can be equally motivated and driven by values, but end up in very different places because they assign different weight to different values. And the new insight that I think our study brings to this is that the same values can also be used to make a case for for sometimes diametrically opposed policy responses. And so we're seeing core values around fairness, loyalty, pride invoked both as a reason for people to leave and as a reason for people to stay. So just one example, the concepts of honor and pride really animate narratives around working abroad and sacrificing to provide for one's family. So, supporting this idea of emigration, being honorable, but are also invoked by, for example, government training programs seeking to keep talented workers at home. So a reason to root people to place. And so we're seeing these values like honor and pride and sacrifice actually be multi-directional, used both to encourage and discourage outmigration. And, I think one takeaway from this is, that people both opposing and supporting migration and different behaviors around migration can be motivated by a different interpretation of the same values rather than what we normally perceive as a different weighting or a different hierarchy of values. And so this is important because, and I think, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, it's not enough to invoke values if we don't understand how they're landing and how they're slotting into a particular context.
Aaron, if you want to include one.
Sure. Thanks. Thank you so much for all coming to this and being here and chatting with us. I'm a disaster researcher by background, and one of our 10 findings focused on risk and crisis. A part that really struck me, I was kind of fascinated by, was some of the narratives and discourses around climate migration. These narratives often popped up after a major disaster like a flood or a hurricane, and they typically talked about hordes of climate barbarians at the gates, people being displaced and moving because of a changing climate and a climate related disaster. I think from a sort of a scientific perspective, this one it missed the mark a little bit when it came to the narrative matching what we were actually seeing and how people experience movement in the context of a changing climate. Unpacking it, first part is it's not just migration. People move in response to climate change related shocks and stresses in a variety of really, really complex ways. They'll go temporarily, maybe circular migration, they'll be temporarily displaced, and maybe they'll even be trapped in place. They want to move, but they can't. Additionally, the reasons that people are moving, they're also really multifaceted. It's the economy, it's issues of vulnerability, it's violence, and then it's another hazard layered on top of these sort of pre-existing conditions. The simplifications of climate migration, they do kind of miss the mark here, and it results in maybe a sort of simplified policy set of solutions. Instead of this focus on climate migration, maybe there should be a little bit more of a focus on mobilities and a little bit more of a focus on some of these underlying factors driving movement. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and that has given us an overview of the whole report. So I wanted to ask also, the report concludes that policies that seek to change migration behavior may not succeed unless they are rooted in a deeper understanding of community narratives around migration decision-making. So what do policymakers need to do to achieve a deeper understanding of these community narratives from your perspective, and what types of policies and messaging have been more successful in accomplishing this?
Thanks, Clara. This flows from what I was just talking about. And I think for me, the fatal flaw in some of these messaging campaigns is that the focus is often on the information we want to communicate and much less on how different messages will actually be received. But we know from mountains of previous research that the way we metabolize information is a social process. It's about the context into which messages land. It's about who is transmitting these messages. It's about how messages fit into what people already believe and also what they're experiencing right in front of them. And so we looked a lot at messages about deterring irregular migration from Central America, just as one example. And if I can just quickly point to 3 lessons that I think we drew from this. One is you have to think about the messenger. So, often people are receiving messages from actors like national governments or even foreign governments that are very much perceived as having ulterior motives. And so these messages aren't taken at face value because people don't trust the messenger. And so they're actually picking it apart to figure out, how to get around it and what it really means rather than just accepting the message as intended. The second thing is that a lot of these messages don't cohere with the reality that people are experiencing. Chaim mentioned earlier a narrative about, the border being closed. You can tell people that the border is sealed all you want, but if people receive even one message on WhatsApp from somebody within their social circle that they found a way through, this discredits the whole campaign. And so this sort of mismatch between what people are being told and the reality that they're either experiencing or that they want to experience is really powerful. And finally, one thing that really stood out to us is that a lot of deterrence campaigns focus on highlighting risks that really don't match up with the sense of urgency communities are already experiencing. So we looked at a lot of community narratives around emigration that are deeply rooted in this kind of life or death rhetoric, which tells us that people have already accepted the dangers of migration as a quote unquote necessary sacrifice, which is a term that we saw in the literature. And so leaving is seen as less dangerous than the status quo in communities that are really experiencing extraordinary levels of violence and insecurity. And also, these government messages often forget how powerful hope can be as a motivator, and it's not rational. Our brains are built to convince us that we can be the exception to the rule, no matter what the dangers are. And so I think if you are not giving people a viable alternative, deterrence on its own is really a very poor tool to shifting people away from this sense of urgency and also this sense of hope.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely something that we can see, and especially like people who work in Central America, I think will agree with what you just mentioned. So the study also talks about the importance of talking about expectations, right? These expectation settings by policymakers, noting that the investments and programs offering development in home countries often fall short. As Salvador and myself, I have seen these. Some economic or development programs are good, but of course, migration still happens. So how should policymakers be more realistic in communicating benefits and countering perception that things will not change immediately? And how can policymakers build trust that they can actually deliver results?
Well, Clara, that's a really important and again, timely question, because it is one of the main responses that we saw across Central America is right now being described as a solution to irregular migration. If we help address the root causes of migration, migration will stop or migration will end. And I think that's where the mistake usually happens in how governments communicate what the benefits could be of international and humanitarian development in the countries of Central America. I think there's a few different components, but I think we need to start by really understanding what's underlying these messages of addressing root causes. For many of the governments in Central America, this is not new. Under earlier administrations, there was a plan for the Alliance over Central America, which is actually meant to try to reduce the root causes for people to emigrate in this case, and then be able to then find hope or stay at home. It, by many measures, did not meet the expectations of what it meant to be. And so it's really starting from a place of doubt for many Central Americans that any of these programs are actually going to lead to specific results and outcomes, mainly because of many different trials before that have failed. Specifically, the governments in this case are motivated to try to reduce migration through this means by trying to combine what their political agenda or their particular priorities are for particular campaigns, but those are oftentimes not really informed by the choice of migrants or what would-be migrants would want to try to find. For example, creating better roads in Central America, specifically in rural places in Guatemala, for example, may actually incentivize migration in the beginning because it's actually being able to increase the local transportation, the infrastructure, but also the income in some communities. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we can think of migration, and as many research studies in the past have showed, migration as part of the development process of Central America, then we can understand that some migration will continue, and that setting expectations to end migration, for example, through addressing root causes, is simply not really set up to succeed. So then the question is, well, what can countries do, or what can countries do to build trust with migrants or would migrants? And I think it starts with building trust, but to build trust in Central America, where trust has been an issue for many different reasons across several years in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, programs that can actually be designed with community input have the larger probability of actually being successful. And even if not immediately successful, being able to include those reflections and narratives of why people may consider migrating may actually be more specific in the moment to reduce some of those immigration perspectives. Natalia mentioned it, and I think it's a really important point. Building in hope to try to create this type of programs requires really understanding the way that people are talking about what they mean by hope and what it looks like for them potentially, so that those programs can actually be addressed. This top-down approaches of saying we're going to invest millions of dollars or quetzales or any other currency in Central America really don't often lead to what the local communities would find most impactful. And that's the bigger piece. And perhaps we are not there yet in Central America in building that relationship, but the more the international organizations consider actually working to set those goals and the programming with the communities of origin in this case, the more that we're likely to have better outcomes in the short and long term. I think in the end, this requires governments to take a step back and to realize that no matter what the response that they can do in the short term, migration will continue. And it's not about ending migration, but it's about managing migration. And if narratives more about that could actually be an important component of it, is instead of, as I mentioned earlier, security and insecurity of why people should or shouldn't leave because of security reasons, I think we will have a better chance of actually addressing some of those flows. It's not easy. And I think that's at the bottom line of this, that investment takes time and is not going to reduce migration. And we have to be okay with that. We have to see that migration is part of the development process and that different countries are going to do it, tailor that development to their specific reasons, that what may work in Guatemala is maybe not going to work in Honduras or El Salvador. And I think sometimes that's not really the easiest way that politicians or congresses in these countries are actually able to perform. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. And we're having a lot of questions, but before that, I would like to ask a question about COVID, because you guys analyze in different periods and you include the period of the pandemic. So I would like to ask this question. What can policymakers learn from the migration narratives associated with COVID? Because clearly migration didn't stop during the pandemic. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn from them?
Yeah, I'll take one. COVID, it permeated some of these narratives that we identified and characterized. And bottom line up front, it's a great example of migration as yet another threat or hazard or threat driver. Bottom line, viewed as negative, it's not all bad, right? So the negative is there was a lot of narratives talking about, migration as spurring on the pandemic and creating additional risks and, exacerbating an additional crisis. There are also a lot of narratives of, migration being shaped by COVID itself, of people moving because the economy was hard, or because their livelihoods have been compromised, in part because of some of the COVID related interventions. This sort of so it's basically a linkage between migration and movement and another hazard. It's migration as yet another hazard or yet another risk. The reality is, look, migration, there are some challenges, and migration can exacerbate certain threats, certain hazards. It can also provide a lot of benefit, both for migrants and for host communities and countries where people end up moving. I think Ariel's his point on community-based approaches and working with communities themselves to identify solutions, that's really powerful here, because that's a way of kind of capitalizing on some of the benefits that migrants bring with them and some of the resources that they have. So a different way of sort of framing the framing the problem as not just a threat, but as an opportunity, could result in beneficial solutions.
Perfect. I will ask the last question, and then we will pass to our audience questions. So in the past months, we have seen an increase of migrants arriving in the US-Mexico border from other countries. In the past, it was more Central Americans, but now we're seeing different nationalities. So with this new transit of migrants, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala have also experienced transit of other migrants with them, right? So now they're both senders and host countries. How are these new flows influencing the migration narratives in the region?
Sure, Clara, I'll take that one. The key, I think it's been on the news predominantly in the US, but also in the region, of how new flows of Venezuelans, Cubans, and Haitians, Nicaraguans has so really attracted the attention, or reoriented the attention to these new populations. And I think while we have done a lot of that in the US, in Central America, we have seen similar effects of this. What most particularly is happening currently with these flows is that narratives are being applied differently to different populations. In Guatemala, for example, there may be narratives about the security of transit migrants coming from Honduras through Guatemala, then to Mexico, and maybe Guatemala is seeking to contain those flows. At the same time, the Guatemalan government and really other stakeholders, including Guatemalan organizations and NGOs, are seeking to improve and provide a better assistance for Guatemalans abroad. Guatemalans are transiting to Mexico and other places, and so therefore providing more opportunities, more protections for those migrants. But now that there's a new and frankly different diversity that they're seeing, and governments are overall not equipped to answer or address these issues, more of those governments are trying to find ways to work with their limited resources to address those issues, but those lead to different narratives. For example, Venezuelans in Guatemala and Honduras in particular have been returned or being pushed back many different times recently, and they have been categorized as sort of the irregular migration of these movements is also security threat, but also not a long-standing sustainable commitment that they can do. So you have, and then you add returnees. We didn't really talk about returnees, but even Guatemala, who receives hundreds of thousands of returnees each year from Mexico and the United States, also has a different narrative about what it would look like to them. So in the short answer to the question is, because of the new layer of transfer migration, now the narratives are getting more complicated. You can apply a narrative to transit migrants, the different narrative to immigrants, and then a different narrative to returnees. And this all in many times become messy in the interchange, but they also reflect how complex and the limited resources that they have to address them. And I think Guatemala is a key example, but again, Honduras and El Salvador have done very similar, taken very similar approaches, specifically with Venezuelans that have increased notably in the last several months.
Thank you, Ariel. So we have a few questions. I will read one question from Sister Rose Nota. She's talking about these ideas, these narratives of fear. So, and she says that it seems right now that policymakers are building on fear and not directly helping people what we can do. So how, I guess the question will be how we can encourage policymakers to embrace more positive narratives from their perspective.
Well, the question, if the question is how to do it, I think it starts by trying to infuse in the current narratives the actual realities of migration and to bring in some of those perspectives directly to speak on that. I mentioned earlier the trust issue about international assistance and development, but really applies to multiple phases of this. If the government can represent and bring in more community members to be the transmitters of those messages, as Natalia, I believe, mentioned in the beginning, they will gain more prominence and have a better chance of actually changing the current, at least adding positively to the current flows. So governments can begin to, for example, include NGOs or at least other community stakeholders to try to provide that messaging as a sort of transparent access to them. But over the long term, what's needed is really to step away from the lack of security, or to really be more realistic about what security implications migration actually contributes, and then focus on the other aspects that Aaron mentioned, which is the contributions that people make, the aspects of how migration may actually be temporary, it may actually be displacement, and some people may want to move but can't. That, I think, is a more longer term approach. But in the early, and by the way, this is not in, I think the question is a very good one, but I don't think we'll, even if the governments were to do this tomorrow, I don't think that we will see the narrative change overnight. I think it will take time. So it's not an easy process, but however difficult, it is probably a significant paradigm change that the governments need to begin to think about.
Okay, we also have a question on education. How do these narratives and messaging affect the education sector in both home countries and final destinations? This is from Elizabeth Ramirez. If you have any answer to this?
I can say a minute, if have a minute on this. I think it's too early to tell how the current narratives are actually affecting education or education institutions, but we are seeing, even in Central America right now, that that these narratives are permeating across different institutions. And so when there are narratives that are, for example, talk about migrants as being security threats or may not be welcomed, that integration of children into schools in Central America and of Central Americans in Mexico and the United States certainly then provide that. We didn't mention this as directly in our introduction, but one of the key components of narratives is that they can actually be absorbed and morphed over time. And so even though a narrative may start in Central America, by the time the narrative is adopted in the United States, for example, it could be really, it could be different, but it could also be more intertwined in different institutions. And it's clear that that could happen. But education was not a specific focus of this study. But I do think some of that security threats and other elements of that could actually do impact how education services are provided. I don't know if Aaron or Natalia have anything to add.
Yeah, just okay. I mean, that would be a great follow-up piece of work, looking at, narratives and education at an intersection. And it kind of goes back to the last point of, how do we change these things, right? So, narrative change, it does take work, and that change, it can come from the top, but it often comes from the bottom, and comes from civil society organizations and places where people gather, and schools and school systems, and communities centered around schools can be a place where changes can occur. So yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's something that's worth exploring in future research.
Thank you. We also have a question from Wesley, asking what role does social media play in passing on migration narratives? If you guys analyze that part, or if you have any sense of what is the role of the social media on promoting these narratives?
Sure. Well, we know that narratives develop from the ground up at the community level and are also transmitted through every mediating institution in society, and also from the top down from politicians, and very much through media and social media. And so I think we always have to think about whether people are speaking from a place of personal experience with migration, or whether their experience is being mediated by others. And we see this very clearly in how people experience threat in their lives. So, you can talk about crime, for example, and levels of crime in a particular community and whether they've gone up or gone down based on hard data over time. But what actually matters is whether people are experiencing more or less insecurity. And it's that relative insecurity that is going to be completely missed by data and facts, and is in fact very influenced by the information that people receive and that they sort of welcome into their lives. And we know that, again, information gathering is a social process. And so people look to their trusted circles for information. They look first, to their immediate family and community, and that's where social media comes in. And then they also look at what they're reading in the local newspaper and seeing on TV. And so this sense of relative change in people's lives is going to be a lot more important in terms of how these narratives form. If people have one experience of something negative happening that they've experienced themselves or a family member has experienced or that they've seen on TV, that's going to be a lot more formative than the sort of dry reality that analysts perceive on the ground.
Thank you. We also have some questions in Spanish. So I'm going to, this one is related to the regional processing centers that the Biden administration has announced. So I'm going to read in Spanish. It's from Cindy Hernández Bonilla, and dice, ¿qué piensan que va a ocurrir con las personas que pasen por Guatemala? Estoy hablando de hay un comentario antes bastante largo sobre los centros regionales, pero la pregunta es, ¿qué piensan que va a ocurrir con las personas que pasen por Guatemala? Y ¿qué piensan de la narrativa de la administración Biden-Harris en la que se asocia a los traficantes de personas migrantes con el narcotráfico?
Okay, I can take that one. So the regional processing centers that the United States had announced, and now they're called a little different, secure mobility centers. What they're expected to do is, as part of a bigger strategy to address different migration management in the region, are intended to provide legal pathways, though they're limited legal pathways for people who potentially could qualify. In Guatemala, this is not new. There has been information centers, resource centers now in Guatemala for a while. There was actually 3 in different lengths of deployment and implementation, but there have been 3 in Guatemala before. I suspect that in the short term, these new centers now, Movilidad Segura centers, will now become more like that, primarily to provide information in the immediate future, but then in the long term, provide more legal pathways for Guatemalan migrants, including H2 visas to the United States, temporary seasonal work for Canada, potentially also Spain, because they have included to this, and in some very limited but particular cases, also transfers of referrals to UNHCR and IOM for protection mechanisms that will then provide them an avenue to the United States or another country. But to be realistic completely about the centers, even if these are implemented quickly, they will take time to really take hold, because for the same reasons we talked about before, there needs to be a significant component that builds trust for migrants to be able to know, or would-be migrants to be able to trust in these centers, to be able to show up to them, to know what their standing would be. And if many migrants go to these centers and they're not provided significant assistance, or they do not see that they're actually helping them directly, that would then that narrative would then go back to the communities. And if many of them know that they won't go there because their cousin or their family member didn't receive any benefits or services, they may then in the future not want to approach them at all. Now, the other part of the question is, what does this mean for the Biden-Harris administration on this issue? The Biden-Harris administration has actually focused and looked on different ways to reduce smuggling operations. It's not a new thing. In fact, President Trump and President Obama before President Biden had done something like this. I just think it's taking a new stage of trying to actually work with governments in the region to try to build those or close those gaps into what trafficking and human smuggling and drug trafficking really mean at once. And to be fair, in some cases, like in Mexico, there are some significant links in how drug trafficking works in northern Mexico, for example, as well as in other places in the country. In Central America, it may be a little different, but the reality is that they deploy similar tactics and it's not an easy challenge to overcome. So generally, it's a good thing to do, but it is not going to either reduce or change that dynamics, immediately. So that is my response.
Thank you. We also have a question from Nikki, and I will read part of the whole comment because it's a little long, but then I will ask the question. So it says, in speaking of how deterrence doesn't work if people are focused on urgency and there is no a viable option, in the development and humanitarian world, we're seeing options from funders to start programs between the US and Central American countries to increase reintegration capacities for returnees and try to reduce irregular migration. So the question, the comment keeps going, but the question is, do you think based on these narratives in the US, Honduras, for example, that creating programs that for reintegration is a worthy investment? Or is the hub of an urgency too deeply embedded that programs to support migrants will not deter migration?
This is a great question. And I think it goes back to what Ariel mentioned before, which is that our goal here is not to prevent migration. Our goal is to make sure that people are not moving out of desperation and that they have viable, safe options available to them, and they have all the information that they need to make decisions. These programs that seek to create opportunities in countries of origin, therefore, can't be judged just based on the migration outcomes, but we have to think about over time if they are planting the seeds for people to have more viable opportunities at home. And I think there are two components to planting this seed. And one is scale, which we talk about in the report. There's a huge mismatch between the demand for jobs abroad, let's say, and for the reasons why people are leaving, and the scale of opportunities that are being created. And that's not a gap that's really easy to cross right now. But what can help us as we get closer to sort of bringing supply and demand closer together is, again, embedding this trust and hope that Ariel was also talking about. If people feel like things are on the right track, if the programs that are being created have been built with community input, that they're taking community needs into account, that they're being managed well, that people have an actual option to succeed if they go through these programs, then that creates this hope and this trust and this willingness to sort of wait and see, rather than thinking, okay, there are no good options here, and we'll have to sort of choose the least bad one. And so I think this idea of hope really goes two ways, and can also be something that we harness to really give people some confidence that the future is going to be better, even if the changes that people want to see are not going to materialize overnight. And we also have to be honest about that, because overpromising and setting expectations that, legal pathways are going to solve everything is not realistic and can create sort of dashed expectations that erodes trust over time.
Thank you. We also have a question from Luis Fernando Godinho. How do your findings relate to xenophobia and how to address it, considering if this is a negative narrative?
Maybe I'll just jump in again and then turn to you, Ariel. This is so interesting because two things. One, I think sometimes we paint all anxiety about migration with too broad of a brush. And lump a lot of things under this concept of xenophobia that actually need to be disentangled. So with large-scale population change and unexpected movements, there is a degree of anxiety that should be expected and that should be considered normal and legitimate. People get anxious around large-scale change, full stop. People are anxious around instability or uncertainty. And I think we have to accept that movements of people that are reacting to certain events, to disaster, to political shifts, to insecurity, can cause that kind of instability. So it's really important not to paint all anxiety about migration with the brush of xenophobia. The other interesting thing is that, xenophobia literally means fear of foreigners or the other. And in this report, we found that a lot of the fear narratives that are typically applied to people of other nationalities in countries of immigration, so thinking of them as a security threat or as an economic threat or drain on resources or even a cultural threat, are actually being applied to returnees, so people of the same nationality. And that's quite interesting. And that also, tells you something really important about how malleable really some of these narratives are, and how they're not rooted in any inherent characteristics in this case, but they're really linked to the fears that people are that are most salient in people's lives. And so, I think that really points to a need for more investment in helping people settle in when they do return to these communities. And, we hear a lot of politicians talking about the quote unquote virtuous cycle of people emigrating and then coming home. And we don't see the policy investment in the coming home part. All of the policy focus is focused on the other leg of the journey. And so I think this sort of leads to an important policy takeaway.
The only thing that I would add there to Natalia's comment is that xenophobia in many ways, just like in the US and other places, is very targeted in Central American context. And so it's not someone, for example, there are public opinion polls that we look at in the document, in the report, and we look at that some Central Americans may have more favorable perceptions of Venezuelan migrants as opposed to migrants from other parts of Latin America, or for example, against Haitians. But I think there's a lot more to be said there about what would likely happen in the future. And I do think, and Natalia brings up a great point, which is it is normal in many of these occasions, specifically for Central America that hadn't experienced emigration or trans-immigration of this length before, for people to initially be to be put into difficult positions to understand what it will likely happen to them. But as more of this becomes normal over the years, I suspect that xenophobia, or the perception of the xenophobia, is also likely to change.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so unfortunately, we don't have time to respond all of the comments, but we thank you all for all the comments and questions that you have posted on the chat. This is definitely an ongoing conversation. We invite you to share the report and discuss it in the spaces that you work in. We are sharing soon the links to the reports. But before closing, I would like to thank our interpreters, Magdalena Navarro and Kathy Kaufman. Now I will pass the microphone to the President and CEO of the National Immigration Forum, Jenny Murray, for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Clara. I want to start by thanking our partners, including these incredible researchers you've just heard from the Migration Policy Institute, RAND, and our partner, the Metropolitan Group. This study offers great insights from and about the Northern Central America region, and about how all of us can think about and perhaps work to talk about migration differently. I know it's piqued my interest, and I can't wait to dive into the report. I also want to lead by thanking Humanity United, who's made the first two rounds of this migration narratives research possible. Thank you so much for your support. So as you've heard today, the report gives us some light on the disconnect between fear and deterrence-based narratives and what migrants actually are thinking about when they consider whether to immigrate. This new insight can help policymakers and others working with migrants, both in the US and in region, consider how to construct narratives that address the real needs of potential migrants. Policymakers need to engage with stakeholders on the ground to ensure that policies that they are pursuing are truly rooted in understanding of what actually move migrants to action. In addition, policymakers must work to build trust. We heard that time and time again in today's comments. Properly setting expectations and delivering on promises to earn the credibility they need to deliver narratives and persuade the intended recipients. And in terms of framing narratives, policymakers must also be mindful of the regional or global context, considering the intersection of migration narratives from broader multi-country perspectives. Finally, I would like to highlight the value of having such a diverse audience today participating in this webinar. Hundreds of you are from a broad range of groups here in the US, Central America, and beyond. Research projects such as this not only generate new knowledge, but also allow us to redefine our strategies based on reliable information and help us provide spaces to discuss new approaches. We hope each of you has taken away at least one, key learning that you can apply to your own work. I know we have, and together we can strive to change the conversation around migration. So I know you're all dying to see the full report. It is now, as we speak, available on immigrationforum.org and migrationpolicy.org, and it will soon be available on the Metropolitan Group and RAND websites. Thank you all so much for being here today, for your willingness to learn. And thanks again to our partners, as well as Clara and the rest of the National Immigration Forum team who made this webinar possible. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.